Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. For those of you who have seen Paranormal or a Cryptid, what's your story? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'm a huge skeptic when it comes to these things. I love reading these because I'm still skeptical, but I've had a couple instances that have shaken me. The one that still makes my blood run cold was when a buddy of mine who was a former Marine found a pretty large abandoned building in a public park in upstate New York. We weren't expecting it, and it was off the beaten path in the middle of the day. It was stable but missing large parts of the wall, and we could see no one was around. It wasn't anything too exciting, just rubble and lots of graffiti. We went to the upper floor and I noticed some satanic graffiti on a wall. I pointed it out to him and we chuckled. We're both metalheads and into the occult. Don't think anything of it. I opened a door that led to a small office, and on the wall directly in front of me is a wall-to-ceiling pentagram in what looked like thick oil paint. There's no furniture or anything in this room. We both stood there for a second, and as I went to take a step toward it, I heard, "Get out," in an even but stern voice, like it came from my head. Before I knew it, my friend started running in the opposite direction. I took off behind him, and when we got outside, he looked at me wide-eyed and asked, "Did you hear it?" He heard the voice too, and he said it sounded like it came from behind us. I've never felt anything like that, and it still gives me goosebumps. I want to explain it away, but I can't accept it in my head. Chupacabra are just coyotes with mange. That's why as soon as Hollywood came up with the name, the whole Southwest was like, shit, I've seen that. They sure look like something paranormal. A healthy coyote doesn't act like one dying of mange, and the abnormal behavior is pretty creepy all on its own. Most of my creepy experiences had pretty straightforward explanations, like feeding the cat, and then my cat walked in through the cat flap. There really was a second cat. He didn't look that much like mine when I was paying attention, but at first glance, their heads and backs were close enough to make the mistake. Another story isn't mine, but a friend's. A tropical storm hit, and she was watching the weather for updates on the tornado watch and warnings when she heard her cat scratching and crying like mad at the front door. Horrified that her pet was outside in the storm, she rushed downstairs to let her in. Her mom caught her just before she got to the door and stopped her. She said, "That's not our cat," and pointed to where their cat was cowering in a corner, eyes glued to the door. They crept around to a bedroom window to look at the front porch and discovered it was a pair of bobcats that were scratching and crying at the door. After some frantic discussion, they opened the garage door part way to give them shelter so the bobcats wouldn't damage the door any more than they already had. It took a few minutes, but the bobcats left the shelter of the porch, entered the garage, and ate the cat food there. One of the bobcats gave birth in their garage that night. As soon as the storm passed, the water receded about a day later. The bobcats carried the kittens back to their den. Based on where we sighted the kittens after that, we think the mama cat was in labor when the storm flooded her den. We think the bobcats had watched her cat come and go, figured any port in a storm. Still, they were very creeped out for weeks after. One time as a teenager, I was making something to eat and randomly heard a bunch of birds chirping super loud. I look up and into the living room and see at least 20 spirit birds flying around the room. Think of the old-style white light effect they used for Tinkerbell. I was a little weirded out, not too much. At that point, I was used to hearing or seeing spirits. And I was also hearing, "Say hi to Mom." So I asked her, I said, "Hey Mom, did you ever have birds, like lots of birds, before I was born?" She stopped and looked very confused. She said, "Yeah, I had 24 wild parakeets when I was a teenager. Why?" I told her because they were all flying around the living room saying hi right then. She never mentioned having birds before. I have a lot of stories, but I'll talk about my camp. My family camp has been in my family for generations. It's an old Native American land with a burial site. We found many things on the land from our ancestors. We have the leader of our tribe who will ride his horse across the top of our sand pit and watch over us. The best thing that ever happened to us would be one night, as we were all asleep in our campers, something came to every camper and ran around them, knocking on them. When we all came outside, We realized the river was flooding really badly, and we had to haul it out of there. The next day, after the rain stopped, we went back to find our little bridge had floated downstream. We had to get some paddle boats from my aunt's house to cross the river, and once we got back to camp, we saw that it was all flooded up to the doors of the campers. If we had stayed there all night, we would have been stuck there, and our vehicles could have been ruined, but luckily something that night warned us ahead of time. I grew up in ass-deep Louisiana. I could be here all night. The most memorable one I have, and I know it'll sound like bullshit, is the Rogaro dogman thing that used to sit in the clearing past our driveway. I used to sneak out of the house and smoke at night and stay up late, standard rebel emo teenager shit, and we lived in the middle of a highway. No towns or nothing for miles both ways. Our only light was a massive searchlight past our garage, and being on a huge property means just about anything from coyotes to panthers could roll out of the woods like it was nothing. But I was used to it. What I wasn't used to was the thing that would sit out in the clearing from time to time, especially in the winter. It'd just sit under the searchlight the way one does when you sit on the ground with your legs straight out, holding its tail and picking at the ground. At first I thought we had just had wolves or coyotes on roids, but eventually I made the stupid white man in a horror film decision to step out and whistle at it. Maybe it was a stray dog. I learned my lesson when it scrambled to its bipedal feet and stared straight at me before hopping the chain link fence and running out onto the deserted highway. It came back every few weeks or so in the early morning or late night, usually sitting in that clearing, digging at the crawfish holes or squatting at the end of the gravel driveway. I'd say F it and just go smoke in our laundry room those nights. I used to have photos of the torn apart crawfish mounds, but I haven't had that phone since 2013. I moved away years later, and I often wonder if it's still there. It wouldn't surprise me. The property was haunted, or at least had bodies buried on it. The headstones behind the barn always freaked me the F out, but not as much as the Rougarou. I still have dreams about the way it stared at me. Nobody I ever told believed me, but my dog and I know what we saw night after night. This happened to me around 2006 to 7, in the summer. My family and friends live pretty remotely in the middle of nowhere near woods, trails, and cornfields. During school, my friend told me about how her family decided to adopt a new religion, whatever that meant. She explained that her family went into a big city to speak to a religious zealot or medium who can see stuff that we can't. She told me this medium knew there was a trail that led behind her house and knew there was a cornfield mixed in with the woods as well behind her home. Nothing spooky about that. It seems pretty common knowledge given the area. Well, the medium also told her there's a demon extraterrestrial or mytho creature that manifests itself behind their home in the woods around 3:14 a.m. in the morning, and it tries to communicate through my friend, which is why she has chronic hiccups. Of course, when she told me all of this, I didn't buy into any of it and thought it would be a perfect opportunity to scare my other friends who were girls in my class. We were all friends, but I liked one of the girls, and that part is irrelevant to the story. Anyways, so I explained the story, and we decided we would go out to the woods that night behind my other friend's house in hopes of seeing this demon or whatever. The girls drove their car over to my house because we could walk to the trails from my house with no problem around 2:30 a.m. It took us about 15 minutes of walking to get to the location. The way the trail formed was pretty spooky because the trees kind of hooked over us, forming a tunnel of leaves and limbs. It was extremely clear that night, and the sound of insects and wildlife was very prevalent, so it wasn't that creepy. Time goes on, and I'm sitting on the ground, and one of the friends is playing on her flip phone, and the girl I liked was talking to me. 3:14 a.m. rolls around, and I start taunting whatever the thing is, and I start throwing rocks in the cornfields and fast woods nearby. About 5 minutes passed, and we decided to head back. No longer did it take for me to stand up and take 3 steps. Everything around us got dead silent. No crickets chirping, no movement. Out of the blue, about 6 feet in front of us to the right, a large branch snaps in two, and we hear the most ominous growl I have ever heard in my life. I've lived here my whole life and hunted. I've never heard an animal sound like that. By the sound of the limb snap, we fully expected to see something stop out of its brush and greet us. Nothing did. The girls jumped behind me, and we just stared at the spot for a solid minute, trying to comprehend what it was. We couldn't see a dang thing. It was pitch black, and our little flip phones didn't have the flashlight like these new phones do. I took a few pebbles on the ground and chucked them in the direction of the noise. Nothing. I decided it wasn't worth the risk of the girls' safety, to head in the direction we came, so I told them to run the other way and I'd lag behind them, just in case if it's soon as a predator that likes to choose. It'd get to me first. As soon as they took off, absolutely nothing followed us. We managed to cut through the woods and onto a road that led to my house. We got back home around 4 a.m. To this day, I have absolutely no idea what it was. We went back a year later, and nothing ever occurred again. I still hear that growl in my head, and it sends chills down my arm. I don't know, mediums and psychics, I understand that there's value with some people, so calling out the region and local flora and fauna is not anything thrilling, but I guess talking about that entity and then seeing something weird is, sure, interesting. I never believed in ghosts and openly mocked people who did. I went camping and my wife and I were going to sleep in the pole barn. I brought the dog into the barn and immediately she was freaking out. This is very uncommon for such a relaxed and tired dog. I was walking around the air mattress and whining. About 5 minutes of me telling her to calm down, a light shines through the aluminum siding. Imagine holding a flashlight on the other side of a curtain and doing a figure 8. It seemed like there was some sort of flashing, shining through the aluminum door. I didn't mention anything for a few minutes as I'm questioning everything I've ever known to be true. My wife asks, "Do you see that?" I say, "Oh, you see it too?" At that exact moment, I realized we both saw it. It turned into the biggest orb I've ever seen, lit up the whole barn as it was daytime. Then it started floating toward us. I yelled at my wife to run, and the dog was already at the door. We ran so fast as we could and didn't dare go back to get the air mattress. Our dog will never walk in that pole barn again. I'm convinced I've had something following me for years, possibly my entire life. I've always had weird things happen to me, weird experiences, like as a kid, I don't remember it, but my mom told me about it. I would wake her up asking about the person in my doorway. Then later, when my parents first started leaving me home alone, I remember having to call them multiple times and have them rush home or someone come get me because I could swear I wasn't alone in the house. Living with my parents, I would hear footsteps upstairs when no one else was home. I once had my wife while we were just dating there, and she heard it too. I would shut a door and then later that door would be wide open. At my and my wife's first townhouse, things would fly off the shelves, like once a box of spaghetti noodles tucked away in the back of the pantry behind other things found its way to the ground without disturbing anything in front of it. Pictures would fly off away from the walls, but none of the others would even be rocking. Some footsteps upstairs, weird things like my ukulele strumming itself in another room. I have very specific and detailed stories, but it's a lot to type out. I don't recall or really care if anyone believes me, but I know what I've seen and felt. Shortly after high school, before I went to boot camp, I went to a friend's place for a get-together he had. My friend and his girlfriend went to sleep, but I stayed up because I don't normally sleep anyway. He lived way out in the country, so I went for a night hike. As I was walking, I heard music. I followed the music to a clearing in the woods and saw what I can only describe as Hillbilly Faye. Hillbilly Faye was sitting on a stump in the middle of the clearing playing the violin. I was mesmerized. I stood there, shocked by the ridiculousness of the situation and by what I was just hearing. For you violin players out there, just imagine hearing how Tartini felt. That was me. I listened to Hillbilly Faye for several minutes and I had to pee. As I went to the back, no grace from the aforementioned Hillbilly Faye. I told my friends the next day, And they were all like, no, not possible. We love being 20 miles from anyone out here. Regardless of that, I would always bring my clarinet over in case I saw this mystery ghost hillbilly fae again. Never happened.